Welcome back to a brand new episode of Bonsai-U. This time around, we're talking beginner bonsai tips for broadleaf species. All right, so this episode is going to be kind of a quick and dirty rundown on some of the basic beginner tips that I have for working with broadleaf species. Now, first and foremost, when we're talking broadleaf species here, we're talking things that are both deciduous and lose their leaves in the fall, and trees that are broadleaf evergreen and will actually hold their foliage all year round. Specifically, we're going to be talking about three species. First and foremost, we're going to be looking at Camellia, which is one of my all-time favorite species for bonsai. We're also going to be talking about Pyracantha and Gardenias. So before we get started here, all of the trees that we're going to be talking about in this episode are for sale on my website. So I'll put a link in the description down below. So if you want to try your hands at building a tree along with me in this tutorial, you can buy one of those trees and we'll ship it to you directly. Now, to get us started here, what I want to do is talk about some of the basic things that we're looking for when we're selecting new bonsai to work with. So if you go out to a local garden center, for example, or your local home store, search around in the nursery section. These are the characteristics that I want you guys to be searching for in the plant material. So first and foremost, number one is trunk movement. These are the primary lines within the trunk. We want to have side-to-side movement, forward and backward movement. The crazier the motion and movement in the trunk, the better it's going to make a more interesting bonsai in the long run. The second thing that we're looking for is taper in the trunk. So at the very base of the tree, the surface root structure is what's called the nebari in Japanese. It just translates to the surface roots that sort of spread across the soil. The wider the surface roots that we can find, the better. The more radial they are, the better as well. And then of course, as you move up into the trunk, we want that trunk to taper and get smaller in diameter as it reaches the apex of the tree. Quite often, it's hard to find trees with both movement and taper, but we're going to be talking about some of the techniques later in this tutorial that can get you both of those things. The third thing you should be looking for is a good branch structure within the tree. Now, a lot of the old-timey books will tell you that you need to have branches on the outside of curves, and that's a good place to start for sure, but it's not the end-all be-all rule. What you do want to have, though, are soft, thinner branches that you can actually bend and manipulate into place. So it doesn't really matter so much where the branch emanates from the trunk. What matters more is where the pad or the foliage actually ends up. This is particularly true when dealing with broadleaf evergreen species and conifers as well. And this brings us to the fourth thing that you need to be looking for when searching for material at a nursery, and that is taper in the branches. Just like with taper in the trunk, we want the branch to get smaller in diameter as it exits the trunk out to the very tip. Now again, there are techniques that we can utilize to create better taper in the trunk, and we're going to cover all of that coming up here in this tutorial. All right, so the first species we're going to be talking about here is the Camellia. Now, like I said before, Camellia is one of my favorite species in bonsai. I fell in love with this tree while I was living and working as an apprentice in Japan. We had a few come through the nursery at Kokain in Osaka, but more often than not, I would see these trees actually in landscapes in different gardens around Japan. They use them as hedgerows or as individual specimen trees. Now, specifically in bonsai, the characteristics that we're looking for with Camellia are small leaves. So we want to select for a Camellia that has naturally small leaves like this right here. We're also looking for smooth trunks with no scars on them. So you don't want to be digging something out of a hedge and hacking it way back. The wounds won't necessarily heal very well on a Camellia. So you want to try to select for something that's young to begin with and then grow it out yourself to have a scarless trunk, which is exactly, again, what we have right here. The other thing that we're looking for are small flowers. You're going to find Camellias with large double flowers, with small single flowers. So you definitely want to find the smaller flowers to be in proportion with the tree. This one right here is a pink flowering Camellia, and it has very small flowers, so it's perfect for use in bonsai. All right, so I've selected this tree out of our garden here. And again, what we're looking for are those characteristics that we talked about before. So we're going to start with the trunk on the tree. Now, on this particular plant, you'll notice that the trunk is actually very straight. We've actually got two trunks essentially. We've got a secondary one down here and our primary one up here. Both of those trunks have almost no movement to them. Second thing, both of those trunks have very little taper to them. So not exactly the ideal situation, but like I said before, we can correct for that and improve both the movement and the taper in the trunk all at once, particularly when we're dealing with younger material like this that's still pliable. All of that being said, one cool thing about this tree is the nebari, the surface root structure. It flares out beautifully at the bottom right here. So that's going to play into the better development of this tree in the long run. That's going to look spectacular as it it flares out more and the trunk thickens over time, we'll maintain that beautiful nabari on the tree, and that's going to add to the eventual taper in the trunk. So first things first with the tree, we're going to select for better movement in the trunk and for better taper in the trunk. So I'm going to bring the camera in a little closer so you can see exactly what we're going to be doing here. All right, so the angle that you're viewing it from here actually has the best and widest nabari or surface root structure. So this is what we're going to utilize as the front of the tree. Typically I start down at the base and work my way towards the top. So finding that wide nabari is absolutely paramount in deciding the front of the tree. So number one characteristic here. Like I said before, the trunk, as we move up through the primary trunk here and onto the secondary trunk right here, both of those are very straight with very little taper. So the beautiful thing about a tree like this is that the diameter of the trunk is actually a little bit smaller than the diameter of my pinky once we get up into the upper portion of the trunk. So we can actually cut a large portion of the trunk back without having to worry about major scars on the tree never healing over. So first and foremost, if I open this up through here, you can see the primary line of the trunk. We have a cluster of branches all coming out of the same area right here. That trunk continues on straight up through here, and there's another cluster of branches up at the top. Well, in my opinion, this is actually too tall to begin with. And of course, like I said, it has almost no taper and no movement. So we can correct for that by removing the latter part of the straight trunk here. So I'm going to come back in here. I'm actually going to cut this off and leave a small stub right here just for safety's sake for dieback. Eventually we'll smooth this out, so eventually this will become the new top on the tree and the line will look seamless. And that scar will completely heal over so you won't notice it at all. Now we do have several branches, like I said, coming out of the same area here. We want to knock that down to 2 to 3 branches. Right now we've got 4 in that space, and that's going to cause some major swelling. So I'm going to go ahead and remove one of these branches for sure that we don't need. I think we'll keep the other 3 for right now. That's fine. All right, now let's take a look at the secondary trunk down here. Again, very long, very straight, no taper at all. So to me, this looks like it's going to be better if we cut it back to a softer branch further back in and try to regrow this either as a larger branch or as a secondary trunk. So if we come further back down in here, we've actually got a really small soft branch here that's going to be perfect for that. It's going to knock the length of this back by about 2/3, and then we can recreate new taper and movement in this branch all at once. So the same thing we're going to do here, cut this back and we're going to leave about a 1/2 inch stub. All right, it looks pretty good. So in dealing with the rest of the tree, there are a few other issues that we have to correct for. First and foremost, we can't see the trunk through here. There's too much going on the front side here. So particularly on the bottom 1/3 of the trunk, I want to remove some branches so we can actually see the potential taper in the trunk here and a little bit of the movement as well. So this branch in particular coming out of the front, we're going to go ahead and remove that. I think that looks pretty good. And then this guy that's cutting across the trunk here, we're going to cut that one off as well. Now, another thing to consider as you're moving further up in the tree, we want the profile of the tree to be pushed back significantly more. We're trying to create somewhat of a scalene triangle shape. It doesn't always necessarily have to fall into that shape, but that's a good starting guideline. So these branches in particular up here are way too long. They stick outside of the profile. So we can actually come back and cut these back significantly up in here, like so. All right, and then the final step here is to apply some wire. We're going to be using some aluminum wire on this tree to create better movement in the branches and the trunk line here. So here is the basic general shape that I want to start out with when I'm first designing a raw piece of material. So again, we've corrected for the taper by shortening the trunk back. We've also corrected for the movement by bringing what was a side branch here back around and then again back towards the right to give us more motion and movement in the trunk. Now, in order to make this look smoother through here and make the transition from where we cut here to this new top, we need to let the apex here elongate over the course of the rest of this growing season and probably all of next growing season. That will also thicken the trunk overall, so we'll have a much wider, fatter base, fatter trunk down here, and then again, better taper and better movement towards the top. Now down here with the directional branch, this thick one over here that may actually become a secondary trunk, we want to do the same thing that we're doing with the apex. We're going to let the shoot at the end here elongate for the rest of this year, probably all of next year, and then eventually cut it back. That'll give us better taper through here and better movement as well. Now, you probably noticed that this branch, the angle of it is a little bit strange. It's kind of hard to tell if it's a trunk or if it's a branch. So I actually want to drop this down a little bit more. The problem is I don't want to put a heavy wrapped wire on this branch because that's going to bite in almost immediately. What we can do instead is actually take a heavy piece of copper wire like this. This is a size 8 piece of annealed copper wire. We can cut both ends to a point at the exact distance that I want between here and actually jam this in as a brace between the main trunk and our main branch or secondary trunk right here. That's going to separate the two. The point at each end is going to jam into the bark so it doesn't slip out. But whatever damage is done by that point to the trunk and to the branch here is going to heal over very easily in the long run. It's going to heal over much more easily than a wrapped wire scar. So when in doubt, use these braces on deciduous and broadleaf evergreen species. You'll have much more success with that in the long run. So this is our piece of annealed copper wire here. Like I said before, this is size 8, so it's quite thick. Now what we're going to do is take the standard wire cutters here and just cut this on an angle at the end. You can see it comes to a nice point that's very sharp, so be careful, don't stab yourself with it. Now what we want to do next is figure out exactly how far apart I want this lowest branch here and the trunk, and then we're going to cut the other end of this wire to that length and jam it in between. So I'm thinking somewhere in the neighborhood right about there. I'm going to cut it maybe a little longer than is necessary to begin with, so we can always shorten it back. Right, so what we're going to do here is jam one end into our trunk here, push that down, and then jam the other end into this trunk here. And look at that, it holds it in place. Now, like I said before, you are going to get slight scarring here at each of these points, but it's almost like a pinprick, and that's going to heal over very easily in the long run, much better than doing wrapped wire down the length of this branch. If that bites in, you've essentially ruined the tree. All right, so this brings us to our second species of this episode, and that is the Pyracantha. So, of course, Pyracantha are famous for their colorful berries, which start to appear in fall. As a matter of fact, right now, some of those berries are starting to appear. They start out as green, and then as you move into the fall season, they'll turn a reddish color or an orangish color. Now, the cool thing about this species too is that it has very small natural leaves, so you don't necessarily have to go searching for a small leafed variety or cultivar. They all have small leaves, which is great. Now, sometimes with Pyracantha, you'll find single trunk or individual trunk trees like this one right here. More often than not, though, you're going to find clump style, where you have multiple trunks coming out of the same point at the base. In either case, they make fantastic bonsai and they develop very quickly. So the first step we're going to be doing with this tree is cleaning up all of the unnecessary tiny fine twigs that are coming out of the trunk, and then choose the angle and choose the primary branches that we're going to be working with. All right, so now that we can see the primary trunk line a little bit better, we can make more decisions about which branches to cut off the tree. Now, like we said before, we want to create taper in the trunk, so a wider base here and narrower as we get towards the top. This tree already has decent taper to it, which is great. The problem with the tree, though, is that some of our upper branches up here are actually thicker than our lower branches. So we want our lower branches to be fatter, have better taper to them from the base out to the end, and then as we move up the trunk, the branches should get thinner towards the top. Well, if you look here, this big guy coming out of the left side is actually just as thick, if not thicker, than our lowest branch over here. Now, it comes out of a good location on the outside of a curve here, but because it's so large, we can't really use the entire thing in the design. So what we can do, though, is actually cut this branch back significantly to a smaller bud here. That's going to push the energy back on this branch, keep this from thickening any further. Then what we can do is allow the shoots at the end of this branch to elongate for 1 to 3 growing seasons, and that will thicken this branch at the base. That way we can balance the look of the tree, create fatter branches at the bottom, and keep the top branches thinner. All right, so what that looks like here, if we look at the upper branch up at the top, we've got a great little bud right here that's coming off the bottom. We always want to try to cut back to branches that are undulating or growing downward. That's going to give us a nicer, more natural look to the branch rather than having to wire it into place. So we're going to come back here, and just like with the camellia, we're going to leave a small stub at the end here just for safety's sake, so that this can die back potentially 2 this little branch here without killing it off. Now the bud here is going to take off and start elongating, so we're going to have to constantly keep pushing that back so that this doesn't thicken relative to the branch at the base of the tree. We also have a similar situation with this branch on the right side of the tree. This is also significantly thicker than our lowest branch, so we're going to treat this one the same way as we did this guy up at the top. We're going to find a downward bud that we can cut back to. This one here actually looks quite good. We're going to take it back, and again we're going to leave a small stub here. And eventually this new bud will take over and we'll have a downward undulating branch. So it looks a little bit strange right now, but this is necessary in this stage of development for raw material that you're picking up at a nursery. All right, then last but not least, we're going to look at the branches at the very top of the tree to pick the best new primary line for the trunk. So again, we've got a ton of movement back and forth through here. And then if we take the logical new apex, which would be this guy right here, we're just going to end up creating a very straight top to the tree, which is not interesting at all. I actually think what we want to do is have more movement going back to the left and again back to the right. So I'm going to take out this guy here. This is too long to be the apex here, but we do have a shoot that's already in a good location that we can wire back to the right to give us that extra movement. So we're going to shorten this guy back. Now on the right side of the tree here, this is a very thick branch over here, so we're going to treat it the same way we did with those two lower ones. We're going to find a downward bud that we can cut back to, shorten that one up. We've also got this big guy coming out of the back, so we want to make sure we keep that relatively small, so we cut that guy back heavily. And same thing with both of these. They're nice and thin right now, but if we allow these shoots to elongate, these also are going to thicken up significantly, so we need to shorten these back again, cutting back to a downward bud. All right, so we've got two final things to do to the Pyracantha at this stage. First, we've got to correct for the directionality of the apex there. So we're just going to use a very thin piece of aluminum wire here, and we're just going to wire the very, very top of the tree. Again, I want to use as little wrapped wire as possible so we don't cause wire damage on the tree and scarring in the long run that will never heal over. All right, so we can whip this guy back around in this direction, add some extra motion to it. I think that looks pretty cool. That's some interesting movement there for sure. Now, what we want to do on this side, like I said before, we're trying to thicken this lowest branch over here. The length of this branch is super weird right now. It's never going to be this long in the long run or the future of the tree. We're going to cut this back at some point to create a much tighter little pad over here. But we've got to think about how to thicken that branch first rather than worry about making the pad look exactly how it should. Now, as this branch thickens over time, it's going to be more difficult to bend down. So I want to go ahead and do that bending motion right now so that we can have the shoulder of the branch in the first section of this movement here be in the right spot for the future development of the tree. Now with a branch this thick, I typically don't like to use a wrapped wire on it, so we're actually going to be using a very thin guy wire here, and I'm going to attach this to the pot. So what you want to do is make sure that you cut the guy wire to twice the length of the distance between whatever branch you're pulling and whatever you're pulling it towards. That way we can have the two ends of the wire meet on top of the branch. We can then pull and twist and move that into place. It's much easier than doing a single strand and trying to wrap this at the end. So I'm going to bring the camera in a little closer so you can see exactly what that looks like. All right, this brings us to our last species for this episode of Bonsai-U, and that is the Gardenia. This is another one of my favorite trees to work with, but you don't see a lot of people in the general bonsai community working on gardenias because I think there's not a lot of information out there. So I'm hoping that this tutorial will kind of help set you guys on the right path and get you more interested in working with this particular species. Now, one thing that sets gardenias apart from the other two species that we worked with is that we can actually do major cutbacks on these guys and hedge prune them basically. We can shear them to shape. They'll create beautiful little pads in an extremely short amount of time. So what we're going to do with this guy, again, we're going to look at the primary lines, try to create taper out of it. But my goal with this is to hack this back to basically nothing, work only with the thinnest branches possible, and then over the next 2 to 3 growing seasons, we'll be able to fill this guy in and it's going to have a beautiful padded look. So the turnaround time working on gardenias is super quick relative to most broadleaf species that we use for bonsai. All right, first things first here, we're gonna cut off some of the very heavy branches on the tree. So the view that you're looking at it from here, I think is actually gonna make the best front. There's a really nice primary line hidden in here that you guys can't necessarily see in the video quite yet. Now on the back side of the tree here, we have a very large branch that's competing with our main apex. So I'm gonna go ahead and remove that completely. That's gonna open us up tremendously here. We also have a very large branch that was attached at the base of that secondary trunk, so we're gonna go ahead and remove that as well. Now with gardenias, when you're making large wounds on the tree, we want to make sure that the wounds are basically flush, maybe even slightly concave into the trunk so that they heal completely flush. We don't want them to bulge out at all, so definitely make sure that you're taking enough tissue off to make it feel at least seamless with the rest of the trunk and perhaps even slightly concave into the trunk. All right, as we move further up into the tree, we'll look at it from the back side here. You can see we still have some very straight, very uninteresting branches towards the top. We're gonna hack those guys off as well. Now on the far left side of the tree here from the rear, you can see we also have a very large branch higher up in the trunk. So for the same reasons that we talked about with the Pyracantha, we want thicker branches at the bottom and thinner branches as we move towards the top of the tree. So we're gonna remove this guy as well. All right, now that we've done that, we can start to see the primary lines emerging within the tree. But one thing I want you guys to think about is that we can always change the angle of the plant to make it more interesting. So if we look at the base of the tree here, this section of the tree between the surface root structure and kind of the first bend right here, this is what's called the tachiagari in Japanese, which translates to standing rising. But basically what it means is that first section of the trunk just above the surface roots. Well, in this particular tree, it's perpendicular to the soil here. So that's not very interesting, but we can correct for that by tilting it one direction or the other. Now, in my opinion, I think it's actually going to be better to tilt the tree this direction and utilize perhaps this as the new primary line on the tree. Now, if we do that, we want to eliminate what we have over here because that's just giving us a competing apex. So I think that's going to be the best option actually. All right, we got a big old branch sticking out of the back here, but this could possibly be utilized for depth. Like I said before, the cool thing about gardenias is that you can hack them way back and they'll flush out everywhere. So with a very long branch like this, we can actually cut it anywhere along this length here and it's likely to backbud further back down. So I'm gonna go ahead and shorten this by about 2/3 at this point, and we may actually wire this into place over here. All right, so this is what the gardenia should look like after you do the major cutbacks on it. And as you can see, I've removed all of the foliage on the tree. We're doing this in late summer, but you can do this anytime during the growing season. Once the first flush has come out, March, April, May, hardened off by mid-May, then you can start doing this type of heavy pruning on your gardenias. You can actually do multiple prunings in a single growing season, but for a massive heavy pruning like this, I would do this probably just once in a growing season, and then the general sort of shearing and pruning, I do multiple times beyond that so that you get that nice padded look very quickly. Now, I know it looks like a skint chicken, it looks ridiculous, but out of all the 3 trees that we've worked on so far in this episode, this tree actually has the most potential to become the best bonsai, I think. Now, the next step here is going to be to wire the primary branches into place. I'm actually going to put a decent amount of wire on this tree. Cool thing about gardenias, they don't thicken up very quickly, so I'm not really that concerned about that wire biting in. However, I will keep an eye on the tree and make sure that it doesn't bite in. You know, if it does, we're going to have to cut that off relatively quickly, but my guess is that wire will stay on for at least this full growing season, over the winter, and then maybe into the first part of next growing season. So let's get that wire on there next. So this is what your gardenia should look like after you do the major cutback, wire, and place the branches. Like I said before, all of these branches are going to flush out with new buds everywhere, not just at the tip, but all throughout the internal portion of the branch. And then we'll begin shearing this tree back probably next year. I don't think we'll do another cut on it this year since we're already doing this a little bit later in the growing season. So we're just going to let this guy grow unimpeded for the rest of the year. Now, all of the trees that we worked on in this episode will be repotted next spring into potentially bonsai bonsai containers, or if we really want to grow the size of the tree, we'll put them either in Anderson flats, colanders, or maybe even small wooden boxes. Any of those options are going to provide a lot of aeration to the roots and a lot of heavy growth at the top of the plant. If you want to maintain a really small compact tree, say for example you want to keep this guy as a small shohin size tree, we could take 80% of the roots off of this guy, this particular gardenia, in the spring and put it in a very small bonsai container and have a beautiful shohin tree within a couple of years. So just depends on the species, it depends on your goal with that particular tree. But with the gardenia, this is exactly what it should look like once you do that initial cutback and wiring. All right, that's gonna do it for this episode of Bonsai-U. I hope that gives you a better understanding of how to work with raw broadleaf material from nursery stock. Once again, if you want to try your hand at building some of these species, we have them available on our website. So I'll put the link in the description down below. We'll ship it directly to you as a raw piece of material, and you can follow along with this tutorial and build your very own Camellia, Pyracantha, or Gardenia. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode of Bonsai-U. If you like what we do here, make sure you like and subscribe down below. And if you really want to support us monetarily, you can click in the link in the description down below, take you to my website, and you can donate to help Bonsai-U going forward. Once again, thank you guys so much for checking out this episode, and we'll see you guys next time around. Take care.